Welcome to the Seattle Area Independent Schools Virtual College Fair. We're so excited to have you participate in this event. We have some fantastic schools with us today. My name is Jessica and I'll be your facilitator. But before we get started, I have a few housekeeping items for you. First of all, your cameras and microphones are off so the panelists cannot see or hear you. You can use the Q&A button at any time to ask questions to your presenters. This is just one of the different sections happening today, so make sure you go back to the website and take a look. This presentation is being recorded and will be available at strivescan.com/SAIS. I'd like to now turn it over to Courtney to go ahead and start the program.
Thanks, Jessica. First of all, hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Courtney Elop, and I'm the coordinator of the SAIS group, the Seattle Area Independent Schools group. Our group is composed of many wonderful local institutions, including Annie Wright, Bush, Charles Wright, the Downtown School, Eastside Prep, Forest Ridge, Lakeside, Northwest, Overlake, Rainier Scholars, Seattle Academy, and University Prep. On behalf of our cohort, I'm so happy to welcome you to our featured panel. Today, you'll hear from some incredible college representatives and community partners as they talk about the ever-changing landscape of admissions and some forecasting for what's to come. As Jessica said, we will have time for Q&A at the end that Maddie Steiner will run. But I just want to say thank you again for spending your Sunday afternoon with us, and we really hope to see you at some of our sessions later on this afternoon. With that, I will pass it over to Peter from Harvey Mudd to get us started.
Greetings, everyone. Welcome to our program. I'm going to speak very, very briefly on a couple of just big topics, and then my colleagues are going to talk in a little more depth about why these might matter. We're all very familiar on the college side that things have been disrupted for you and for us. I would like to think that what we went through this past year gave us a little bit more confidence and maybe tools to figure out how to manage what could be an uncertain process. And we understand that many of you students and families are waiting on us to make decisions, and we need to have, it's helpful if we have a little more certainty too. So in a lot of ways, I think these changes have made it more important for relationships to be built and for people to connect with each other. But we understand on the college side that things would have been very different for you in the delivery of the instruction. Grading might be very different from school to school, district to district, state to state, country to country. That your ability to engage in activities and usually toward the end of your high school career to become a leader or to do summer programs, some of those may have been certainly affected, if not cut short. Your ability to form relationships with your peers, and importantly with teachers who are going to write letters of recommendation for you, interrupted. But one of the things that also helps us, and we're certain about that, is that we have found other tools to try to engage with you, and it's certainly very useful if you students engage with us and actively, join in. So let us hear sort of your voices, concerns, and the things that you're eager to learn about. So I think those are some of the main themes that are my main takeaways from this last year. There are some other things I could bring in about how students applied differentially, but that just was a trend last year, and we'll see how things go this year. So I'm going to leave it at that with these sort of big themes, and we'll come back to see how many of these we cover in our session.
Great. Well, good afternoon. Thank you, Peter and Courtney and Jessica, for kicking us off. I'm Joey Seltzer. I work in the admission office at Bates College. And later this afternoon, I think each of us will be in a room to talk more about our specific colleges. So we look forward to answering your questions about anything particular to our schools at that point. One thing that I have been talking a lot with students about in this last few weeks is activities. Peter hinted at this as well. We are fully aware, particularly for students applying this year, that the resume or the activity list that you're going to submit to our colleges may look really differently than your older sibling or someone who graduated from your school just a couple of years ago. And feel free to make full use of the application to explain that. Don't assume that we're going to totally understand. Just feel free to remind us, like, oh, by the way, this experience has affected my sophomore year, my junior year, and my senior year. And this is the way that it translated to my experience. The exciting part of that, I think, is when I'm talking to students about the next step in college and the 172 plus opportunities for student clubs and organizations on each of our campuses. It's still an incredible time to explore. So I would encourage you to, even if you're feeling frustrated that you didn't get that opportunity in high school, there's so much more time. And so take advantage of the resources that we have online to start to think about what you might sample in your first year of college in terms of activities and clubs, the things that maybe you missed out on in high school because it wasn't available to you. We are excited to offer that to you next year. And feel free to include that in your application as well, to say the thing that I was really excited about in high school that I didn't get to do, but I'm excited about at your school is this and this and this. So take advantage of the application to kind of highlight both the missed opportunities and what you're still excited about exploring at our college campuses.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm super excited to be in conversation with you today about lessons learned from last year's cycle. My name is Nicole Reynolds. I'm Director of Enrollment Marketing and Communications and Senior Associate Director of Admission at Mount Holyoke. And I guess as I was thinking about the answer to this question, three sort of main areas, categories of the way that we do our work came to mind. The first is recruitment, of course. It used to be that in-person recruitment really ruled the day, right? So our school visits or direct interactions at college fairs across the table, or your on-campus visit when you would come to take a campus tour, that's no longer the case, right? COVID really derailed that program for all of us last year. And so we all had to shift to virtual engagement opportunities with prospective students. And even now that we can do in person again, I'm actually coming to you from Seattle right now, and I'm excited to do some school visits in person this week. I think that we're going to see at all institutions continued creativity around how we reach and engage with prospective students. So I think that hybrid model is sort of here to stay. And the silver lining then is that really allows us broader access to students that we might not have been able to reach in the past. So students in rural areas. It also means, even for those of you who can, come to do the campus visit or the in-person school visit, that there are more touch points because you can also engage with us virtually. We all expanded our virtual options and sort of the platforms in which we reach you. So be sure to take advantage of that. The second category where our work really shifted, and Maddie will speak a lot more about this, is evaluation, right? And the way that testing plays into our evaluation of students. So there are some broader shifts afoot in your access to testing, but also in the way that institutions are thinking philosophically about testing and using that in our evaluation processes. I think a benefit is that it really allows us to shift the focus away from a single test score, right? Some of us have been test optional for a while, some not. But to really think about what a student's daily performance in the classroom looks like and what the context of their broader lives are as it relates to that daily performance. So that's been a shift in many offices. And then the last change that I've seen is in the way that we build the class. So it has been the case that all of our institutions rely on predictive models that are data from years past about how many admitted students are going to say yes to our offer of admission. Well, COVID threw all of that out the window because there were financial uncertainties for families. There were maybe some concerns from students on the student side about going so far from home, right, when they might have made a bolder move in the past. So all of those models that we were working with didn't work last cycle. And so we had to really get savvy about how we were going to build a class. And one of the ways that a shift happened at Mount Holyoke, our response was to make more strategic use of our wait list. And for the first time in our history, we sort of went to the wait list to begin building the class before the deposit deadline. And so that was certainly a shift, is more strategic thought about how the wait list could support our enrollment goals. So I'll pause there and hand it over to Neil.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Neil Agaluz. I'm with Tulane University. I'm one of our directors. And, I would echo much of the things we've already talked about. I think one of the major points that I wanted to really emphasize and Nicole brought up is that there are so many factors in the process. And I think as students, you should really be maybe excited to kind of take advantage of the fact that all of these other factors have never been more important than they have been in this past year and will continue to be. As we know, there's been a lot of disruptions over a solid year and a half for students. We're seeing a lot of pass-fail grades, that sort of thing. We may not have test scores. We may not have traditional interactions with students. And so I think for you as a student, it's a really exciting, but I know a bit of a challenging time to emphasize some of these other factors that you think might really describe who you are, where you don't have to rely so much on those kind of traditional things where you feel, okay, my GPA and my test score is really the main factor here. I think you should take advantage of that and emphasize the other things. And maybe they're not traditional activities, and maybe they're things that you've been doing more locally in your community because interactions look a little bit different today. And so I really wanted to emphasize that there are so many factors, and I think you should absolutely feel free to consider that anything that makes up your personality is probably something that's worth putting in an application for us. So don't forget that there are a lot of things, a lot of pieces that make you you, right? Another thing that I wanted to talk about is sort of that engagement. And I think one of the things that I really have enjoyed seeing is that students do tend to engage a little bit more directly with me now via email. And so you shouldn't feel afraid to ask questions about specific things that you're maybe not getting out of a virtual event or something like that. And we're really excited, I think, to offer some more creative ideas as to what we're doing. Live streaming campus tours where we're doing a live question and answer, these sorts of things. So I think know that you also have a little bit of power in this process there. And we want to give you what you want to see, right? We want to give you an honest look at our institutions. And so never feel afraid to contact us if there's information that you really wish you had gotten that you just haven't found yet. We're always happy to have those conversations. And so, yeah, I think big picture, context is everything. And we certainly understand that everyone's been going through a lot. And I think some of those anxieties that you as students have, trying to get a test done, a standardized test, worrying about pass fail in a semester, or worrying about maybe a semester where you really didn't perform up to your own expectations because you've got a lot going on. I think understand that we understand that. Feel free to talk about those things. Please reach out to us if you're unsure where to put it on your application. I think a lot of times communication is it's key, but a lot of times students, I think as teenagers, it feels uncomfortable to reach out to us. But please know that we would love for you to provide that context to us. We never want to have to fill in a gap in your application with sort of unknown knowledge, right? So yeah, I'll end it there and I'll pass it on to Jocelyn.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jocelyn DeYoung, and I serve as the Senior Associate Director of Admissions for Recruitment and Communications at the University of Washington in Seattle. Thanks for having me on the panel, Courtney. This is an interesting conversation to look back at the last year and a half. And really, I guess I come at this from the perspective of a large flagship institution. And what we saw last year was quite a bit of growth in our applicant pool. And a lot of unpredictability. So as Nicole mentioned, we really had to lean heavily on our wait list. And what that translated to for students and applicants was very large wait lists. But because, again, we didn't know what was going to happen, we didn't end up going to the wait list this last year because students were saying yes at higher rates than they had previously. So unpredictability, large applicant pools. We saw that amongst other flagship institutions. It seemed to be that students were applying to schools whose names they knew, the brands that they knew. And I would just encourage you to maybe think a little broader than just the schools that you're aware of, and really do your homework. And clearly events like this where you can meet other institutions is a great opportunity. The other thing that we saw, so we use the coalition application, and similarly, I know the common application has a section at the coalition. It's called the natural disaster section, where you can basically tell a little bit more about how a natural disaster like COVID or wildfires or other impacts, flooding, et cetera, impacted you as a student. And it was just a little pick list, but what we learned last year is that we really wanted to know a little bit more. And so I'm encouraging students to in that additional space section, or the COVID impact, is kind of what we're calling it right now, because COVID is the impact, is to just tell us more. How, was your internet unstable? Did you have to go somewhere regularly or take care of family? Were you impacted with someone sick? Those types of additional pieces can really provide more context to us when we're reading your application. So we're hopeful that next year we'll be able to spread that news, and that students will be able to expand on that a little bit more. So those are my couple thoughts. And I think, Peter, are you next, or is Maddie gonna go? I can't remember our order now because we were doing alphabet.
I think, Peter, you were going to maybe mention some closing thoughts with regard to what other folks had said, and then I can introduce myself and we can talk a little bit about testing.
Sure. Thank you, Addie. So I have some of the themes I'm kind of sew things together for the conversation so far. And 4 particular themes have come to mind about this. One is that colleges in many ways had to move from what may have been perceived in the past to be a sort of, in some cases, a formulaic selection process to something that was far more interested in the student as a person. And I think that's something that you students can take advantage of in helping to tell your story. Even if you were in sheltering in place, you may have had a lot more discretionary time. And what might have you done with that? Were there new interests? Were you creative in the way you saw an opportunity to help others? Did you step into that? Those kinds of things. I would also say that colleges have tried to lean more heavily in response to that to help the student understand our culture. And each college has its own culture, its own sort of style and personality, in as much as colleges have personality. Even large schools do. Small schools, it just is not a factor of size. It's a matter of place and community. And so we're trying very hard to help the students understand what they would be looking for or finding on our respective campuses. A third thought I had, and that's been alluded to by my colleagues, but I'm going to say it more forcefully, that the opportunities and the disruption of this pandemic are not distributed equally. And certain families have felt the brunt of this far more heavily than some others. Some students have a nice, comfortable room in which they could do their work and then find ways to recreate. And some other families were really put to the task to try and maintain almost anything of familiarity in their daily lives. And so while we're not looking for a long list of we're looking for your story, I guess is the main point I would say. And we want you to be willing, if you're, as much as you're comfortable sharing that kind of information with us. And then the last thing I wanted to point out to empower you students is to remind you that there are 3 key decisions in this whole process. And you students hold 2 of them. You decide which colleges to apply to. That's why we're sending you all this crap materials in the mail, and we're sending you email messages about every 45 seconds, it seems. And but you get to decide which colleges you're actually going to apply to. Certainly, there's a lot of attention paid to what we decide on our end, which has been, I think, much more culture-based as well, rather than, as I said, formulaic. But then you get to decide which college you're going to go to. And unless you've cloned yourself, you're only going to go choose one of them. So you have a lot more power than you may think you have. And at this time of year, we're very interested and maybe even a little bit eager or anxious about what decisions you're going to make, because that sets everything in motion. So as I said before, it's about relationships. And the more we can build those relationships between us and you, I think the stronger your candidacy might be. So I'll leave it at that, and I'm going to turn it over to Maddie.
Awesome. Thank you, Peter. And thank you, everyone else. I'm super stoked to be on this panel with a bunch of really talented, bright admissions reps. Folks out there, you might be curious as to why is this person, Maddie, here? They are not from the college side. And that was intentional. So I'm a senior director of outreach for a company known as Compass Education Group. And as a business, I think we're most well known for doing one-to-one in-person or online test preparation for students across the country, sometimes around the world. But in equal measure, I think we're seen as a consumer watchdog for the testing industry and are often relied upon for the very ethical, data-centric, up-to-the-minute information that we provide on all things pertaining to testing. If you're curious, we also provide a semi-annual guide to college admission testing, which does its best to index all of the varying policies, details about the tests themselves, all of that good stuff. So that way, as we're talking today, you can take a peek at some of those resources and just let the rest of this conversation just kind of wash over you and enjoy it. But I was asked to just talk a little bit about the context of testing, a little bit of a history lesson, and then I'm going to pose just a few questions to this really diverse and interesting panel of college reps who have, I think, probably different relationships with testing, both prior to the pandemic and also now as a result. So I'm just going to take a quick step back and look at the class of 2021, which saw the brunt of the pandemic, right? And as a result, test site availability plummeted majorly, especially in specific states like Washington, which pushed an en masse adoption of test optional policies. But they were not monolithic. They were different flavors of test optional policies. Those that were wanting to go test optional permanently, those that were engaging in a multi-year trial, hoping to have data do the talking for them. And then also those that said, this is just a one-year temporary thing. We're doing this as a necessary dispensation to do what's karmically right for students, but it's likely that we'll return to requiring tests in the future. Also, a lot of the language was different amongst colleges, although you would see some repeating of phrases like, your application will not be disadvantaged if you fail to produce a test score. And it was up to you as a family to divine the line, also in collaboration with your college counselors and maybe admissions officers. Is your policy a way of saying, we would still love to see a score if you could safely obtain it? Or is it really just moderately or even barely additive in your application, and for the purposes of safety, your sanity, don't even worry about the testing mess, you can sidestep it entirely? And then there were other schools that were, so I'm beamed in right now from my backyard, which is downtown Los Angeles, and the UCs are not too far away from me. And you may have heard that they, among some other colleges too, decided to go test-free, meaning that you couldn't even report a test score. It wasn't considered whatsoever within the admissions process. Although there are some funny backdoors to, like things pertaining to APs that are still technically a part of the review process. So generally what we said at Compass was that the conversation around testing is maybe for the class of 2021, yes, the decision to take these exams may have been impacted a great deal by the pandemic, but we wanted students to have the ability to make strategic decisions around submitting of test scores. And I think that's going to be even more the case for the class of 2022 and beyond, that there's more deliberation and that the choice to sit for a test isn't being totally robbed from you because of a lack of access to test sites. Although we are still seeing that somewhat for the class of 2022 as the pandemic continues to linger. When we looked at the kind of summary of data from colleges that were willing to report this information around who submitted scores, what admit rates were, what the score ranges were among students that were applying, it's clear that, at least for some contexts, and I think a lot of the families that we work with are often looking at some highly selective colleges, that there did appear to be some correlation between higher acceptances, and this is among schools like Georgia Tech, Colgate, Georgetown, Boston University, et cetera. And they were admitting students in higher numbers with scores as opposed to those without. And this is not to imply causation, by the way. I want to throw that out there, that just because you're submitting a score does not necessarily mean you're more likely to get into a school. It's also highly likely that students that received really great test scores also had other elements of their application that were super strong. But that's kind of some of the information. And it was also alluded to earlier that schools had a little bit of difficulty without the metric of test scores and predicting yield, right? Who was actually going to say yes or no once they received an acceptance letter. Now here we are for the class of 2022, and unfortunately, my heart goes out to all of you. The pandemic still lingers, and you may not have had the opportunity to to test. So I think some of the lessons from last year still kind of carry over. But I'm still very much of the belief that testing isn't so much optional, but again, it's another arrow in your quiver, and it's more of a submission optional practice. And I guess I'm going to now shift the conversation to the rest of the group and say, so there's data out there, research that shows that broadly, tests have been acclaimed, they've been useful for the purposes of, in combination with rigor of coursework and GPA, that they are incrementally additive in predicting freshman year GPA. But there are certainly other things that you might be using test scores that are of utility to your institution. I would love to hear from each of you as to whether or not tests are valuable, maybe less valuable at your institution, how they're factored into the process, especially when you're receiving diverse applicants from different backgrounds. We often hear that test scores are useful context to help validate the transcript. And then my last question, and I realize I'm throwing a lot at you, so you can kind of pick what you want, because I get this theoretical thrown at me all the time. I would love to get your take. Let's say you had two students that were fairly commensurate in all elements of their application. I know this hypothetical is a little weird, but two of them were applying from rigorous Seattle area independent schools, strong students, great extracurriculars, personal statements are good. But both of them end up obtaining scores that fall within the bottom of your annual reported ranges or average ranges of test scores. One student decides to submit that score and the other decides to withhold it. How would you approach that choice of submitting that score versus withholding, right? So I think with that, folks within the panel, would you be willing to maybe tackle any of those questions and maybe talk about how you're looking at test scores these days?
I'll start. Thanks, Maddie. So I have the good fortune of working for an organization that has been test optional since 1984, and Bates really is, in many ways, the national leader in the conversation. So I feel kind of the responsibility to speak first in some respects. And for folks listening, if you're curious about the research and understanding the predictive value of testing in the college process, look at the Bates research. It proves that for Bates and lots of schools like Bates, and even lots of schools that aren't like Bates, there is no predictive value in standardized testing in terms of students' performance and success and persistence and graduation rate in college. So with that confidence, we encourage students to submit testing if you've taken it and if you feel good about your scores. But if you haven't, or the only test you can take is a 4-hour drive away and it means you have to miss your senior soccer game, I would encourage you to make a choice that works best with your family this year. There are wonderful opportunities this year, particularly because of the pandemic, for schools to accept your application without testing. So make full use of all that's available to you. Bates has been, our dean in particular, Lee Weissenberger, has been on the phone. She's been on Zoom. She's done a lot of, I think, text coaching with a number of deans across the country, helping coach kind of the industry into this process. And she's got a great YouTube video if anyone wants to watch that or take that back to your own education communities about how this process works without standardized testing. So I'll throw that out there. The hypothetical situation, I'm curious how other folks would respond to that. It's impossible without the full context, but I might say we'll just admit both. I'll take the easy way out. But that's something, maybe a more honest answer is to encourage students who have taken testing and are concerned about submitting a lower score, is to talk with your college counselor. You all are attending excellent schools with really savvy college counseling. So take advantage of that resource and talk it through with your school counselor.
I'll jump in as a school that's also been test optional for 25 years at this point, to say that scores have never driven our decision-making process at Mount Holyoke. And so the shift during pandemic was not a tough one for us. In a typical year, about 30% of applicants to Mount Holyoke would not submit their test scores. And it was well over 50% this year. And that shift was absolutely fine for us. We're really looking at a student in the context of their school, at the rigor of their program, at the progression of their courses, and at their grades and grade trends over time. What we don't do is reduce students to a GPA or a test score. So what we say at Mount Holyoke is that if your test score is sort of somehow in alignment with your transcript, right, with the strength of the program that you presented there, and you're proud of your test scores, submit them. We look at them at the level of academics, right, as we're assessing your academic potential and achievements. But if you don't submit them, we don't ask why. So in this hypothetical, I would say that it is never the case that we are comparing an apple to an apple, right? There is such range in an applicant pool and such diversity of applicants. And what we're really doing as we make decisions within our applicant pool is not looking at a single element, but we're letting decisions be guided by the institutional goals and priorities that are set for a given year, right? And at Mount Holyoke, that would be leadership, you know, in addition to academic excellence, it would be sort of leadership development, diversity of the applicant pool. And so those factors are more important in our decision than sort of a test score. And I will also add as a point of reassurance that if we see an element of an application that's anomalous in the application, right? A student is presenting a really strong transcript with great rigor and they've really proven their academic chops with a low test score. We bracket the test score in our evaluation, right? We say, oh, that seems really out of sync with the rest of what this student is presenting. So we're not going to let an admission decision turn on that anomalous element. So hopefully that's reassuring to some folks.
Yeah, and I'm glad I'm getting to go next because Tulane actually comes from essentially a complete opposite perspective. We've not ever been test optional until the pandemic. And I think it's also, without trying to throw anybody under the bus, it's also really important, I think, students, that you understand there's a lot of internal politics that we all deal with, you know, and our leadership for a very long time has been doing this sort of internal data analysis, you know, exactly what Joey was saying, you know, looking at predictability of our student success and retention and staying and being successful in college, and what is more predictive. And for a very long time, you know, we've also seen internally, it's your performance in high school more than your test scores. And it's an argument we have attempted to make for a long time, and we finally successfully did because there was a pandemic. So, you know, we're happy that it's happened because I think in a lot of ways, I'm not going to specifically answer any of the questions coming in, but I'm sort of seeing the themes in there. In a lot of ways, it's become freeing for us. A lot of schools have a lot of priorities, and having test scores be a major one has really, in a lot of ways, held us back, I think. You know, when other people are really concerned about how high a test score is, you might see an applicant who is fantastic, and then that one factor, the test score, is suddenly disqualifying for whoever it is taking a look at that big picture. You know, as Nicole said, we're very, very rarely saying, here's a group of 3 students and let me make a decision on them. We're stepping back and looking at the big picture and saying, what are our institutional priorities? And when one of your institutional priorities is test scores, it makes it very hard for you to hit those other priorities, which is being a more diverse institution, having a group of great leaders. And so, you know, I would just say from a personal perspective, it's been incredibly freeing to be able to see these students who are fantastic. And I don't know how they would have tested, but they didn't give me a test score. And so I can see they did great in high school. They challenged themselves. There was a great trend. And I don't have to have some other thing that just sort of bursts my bubble on that, right? So I think certainly, you know, to the hypothetical scenario, again, we're never comparing too directly, but you know, whenever a student's test score is not in what you might consider a good range for a college, it doesn't hurt you, in my experience, not to send it. You know, we had almost a half of our students admitted this year did apply test optional. So we had no scores for about half of our admitted class. So we do take it pretty seriously. And I think most institutions do. Definitely don't, you know, drive 5 hours to try and get a testing seat or something in your time. You know, I think if you can't test, I've been telling people for 1.5 years, don't test. You know, it's also, again, back to what I mentioned earlier, always communicating with schools, because there's always going to be a little bit of detail here and there that, like, oh, it's a slightly bit of a different conversation for our college. So also recognize that with thousands of different colleges come thousands of different sort of personalities and priorities and ways of operating. So it's always worth asking. But I think big picture wise, we're all kind of so far talking on the same themes there.
Yeah, don't drive 4 hours and don't fly to Montana or Idaho. I heard stories of families doing that last year. It was just crazy. So at the University of Washington, we've removed the test score requirement. All public baccalaureates in the state have removed the requirement. It was a state requirement that has been changed. So just know that all public schools in Washington are now test optional. We say test optional. Last year, out of 48,000 applicants, we had about 18,000 submit a test score. When your application is reviewed, it's read twice, sometimes 3 times, depending on how off the 2 readers might be as Washington residents. And what we know to be true is that our academic assessment of you, so we give you a score based on the rigor of your curriculum, senior year schedule, grades and courses, grade trends. We also look at your GPA, and we also have information about what the average GPA from your particular school is. So we know what how students who are admitted and then how they perform at the UW. So we're very data rich. And so our academic assessment was actually more predictive of a student's first year success at the University of Washington than standardized test scores. That's Washington residents. Non-residents was a little bit different because we didn't have all those data elements about the particular school that they were coming from, average GPAs, et cetera. Back to my 18,000 students submitted test scores, again, not looked at until our director went to select the class. And at that point, with those points where he's drawing the lines, literally to be kind of crude about it, he then went to see if there was a test score. So for about 200 students, he looked at test scores. And in that scenario, it may have then put them on the wait list or give them an invitation to the wait list, or it might have moved the needle and gotten them admitted to the university. So for those 200, certainly it could have made a big difference. So that's why we're saying submit the scores if you have them, but know that for the vast majority, they're not going to be a factor, and they're not even going to be seen. Even if you wanted them to be seen, they're not necessarily seen. So that's how we're doing it at the UW. And I think Peter's next.
Yeah, so we have a very different relationship with tests than I think almost any other school here, because we were one of the holdouts prior to the pandemic where students would have to submit SAT subject tests in addition to SATs. It may not be familiar to you because we've abandoned them. All US colleges have abandoned them. I believe that's the case. Maddie can back me up on that.
Yeah, and College Board no
College
longer
Board has abandoned it.
Yeah,
So-
they're not even in existence anymore.
Right. So out the window, and we moved to not even considering it. So even if a student had a great score, we're like, we don't want to look at it. Our own institutional research has pointed out the strength of that math level 2 test, in as much as it had existed in the past, for showing a reasonable predictive ability, but only on the negative side. Below a certain level, a student would more than likely struggle. We didn't like that being a negative factor. And again, we abandoned that test. As a consequence, the SAT and ACT proved nothing for us. And moreover, and Maddie's question about if it's supposed to be predictive in the first year grades, well, the first semester here is passed on credit. So we're going to base it on one semester of work when who knows what have happened in your life. I mean, that's kind of bad data analysis to do it that way. So we reorganized our selection process to be much more focused on the kind of culture and academic program we have here, and try to find students' attitudes and values and how well those matched up. So in answer to Maddie's question, hypothetical, I think the question of the student's fit with us would override anything to do with the student's kind of numbers in that sense. In terms of the testing profile, we figured out fairly early on that a little less than 40%, the actual number is 38%, of our applicants did not submit test scores. Only after we had sent admission decisions did we calculate what the admitted pool looked like. And it was 39% of our admits who did not have test scores. And then it turned out, since the students make the final choice, that 39% of the students who enrolled did not have test scores. So I think that's as transparent and clear as it is that the SAT and ACT don't add value tremendously to us. And we can say it's there, it's not, and that's about all of our conversation rather than comparing it to past year's averages and things like that. And if a student doesn't submit a test score, we don't ask questions about why there's no test score. It could have been a student's choice. They did take the test, they don't reveal it. They never got a chance to take a test. We're not asking that question. So we just don't know and we don't ask.
I just follow up to that. If you're looking at students at Seattle area independent schools that have predominantly decided to take these exams and have submitted them to your institutions historically, there then wouldn't be an assumption that they aren't either withholding the result for a reason, or wouldn't that seem kind of out of the ordinary based on years of kind of prior behavior from these students and what you're also seeing from a lot of their peers who are maybe still submitting scores to this day? So I'm just curious, I do understand kind of the broad reasons for why test optional is, extremely useful, provides great agency for students. I did hear earlier that, and I agree with this, that test scores can be beneficial if also they are in alignment with kind of other elements of the application, especially GPA and academic rigor. If a student wants to show that strength, then why not? But it seems like there's kind of a little bit of confusion here. And I'm thinking about as a parent taking in this information. On the one hand, there's a very kind of like pro test optional focus. Then what is also the reason for, I guess, so many students still wanting to sit for these tests, to throw the option out there, to have that data shared? And then also, it seems like there's still some institutional reliance on test scores, especially amongst the more highly selectives. So it feels like a little bit of, I'm getting a little bit of cognitive dissonance when we talk about it. So I don't know if anyone wants to follow up with that.
Well, I mean, I think in terms of like students not having scores, I think we probably all stopped reading into it pretty quickly with as many testing dates that got canceled. A parent was just putting in the questions about how they're still finding limited options, in the Seattle area. And so I think that really, at least during the pandemic, has absolutely thrown out, it's our jobs not to add anything to an application when something is missing, right? But I think now it's not even like a possible thought exercise. Who knows why somebody wasn't able to send a score. I think the other thing that I've always kept in mind is that testing is something that tends to advantage students that already have advantages. And so retesting is really how students typically get those higher scores. And so just the idea of somebody being able to take a test 2 or 3 times during the pandemic, sure, maybe you got it once, but I mean, I feel like that sounds fairly impossible. So I never have an expectation at all. And we've had plenty of students that we'll see, ask me questions about testing, and it is around that kind of, I took it once, I thought I would do well, I didn't do that great, I think I could do better, should I try again? I'm like, it's, if one drops in your lap, go for it, but I don't think it's worth the exercise of trying to figure out why somebody didn't submit one, honestly.
I think you're naming an important tension that I want to say a word about too, which is we're saying, right, we're test optional and we embrace that philosophically. Then why were so many of us not test optional, right? Until there was this big push so test scores must still matter, right? So that's the tension that you're naming. I would say there's a bit of a chicken and egg thing happening here, which is that students very often make college decisions based on rankings, right? We all know this, and there are schools that really advise students carefully around fit, and we certainly hope that students will prioritize fit in their college search. And it's also true that test scores factor heavily into the rankings that go out there, right? What is the mean test score, and and that gets a lot of weight in a lot of these publications that you're reading where you're identifying those rankings. This shift, in my opinion, one good thing that has happened about those shifts is that a lot of those evaluative ranking services have downgraded the value of test scores in the overall ranking. And so I think that we're going to continue to see that shift. And in my opinion, it's a good thing, but many schools are very new to navigating this philosophical tension, right? I can say definitively that at Mount Holyoke, if I see Seattle area independent school applicants without test scores, I won't bat an eye. We have had for many years people not submitting scores because they understand the tension that Neil just named, right? It maps onto socioeconomic status and a student's access to resources and not necessarily their potential. Again, if test scores are submitted, we think about them at the academic level. If you're proud of that work and you want it to reflect on who you are academically, we'll look at it, but it's not a priority.
Thank you,
No, sorry,
Nicole.
can I add, like 30 more seconds? Like, so appreciate the last two comments and kind of want to pull them together, just given that, you know, we were inspired by the UCal system or California system going test free, and felt a lot of energy around here around that conversation. And we, I think, quickly had to become really honest about how race and privilege play in the process and how that's deeply tied to testing. And as an institution, you have to be willing to stand up against it. And so again, you know, the California system doing that is super exciting. And I hope this conversation continues and more of us join the bandwagon.
Thank you. And I want to obviously allow some time for Q&A, and you've been given me the opportunity to read some of these questions. So something that came up that I think might be interesting to all of you. A question came up about demonstrated interest. So first, the question is, how important to your college is, quote, demonstrated interest? What counts as exhibiting interest? Are virtual visits currently considered equivalent to in-person campus visits? And maybe someone wants to even define what demonstrated interest means.
I can take this because we tend to get, I don't know, a lot of this comes our way sometimes. We absolutely are looking at demonstrated interest throughout the process. I don't really like the term because in my opinion, it sounds like a student is checking off boxes and we're going down a list and saying, did they do this? Did they do this? You know, it's much more about the bigger picture of how engaged is the student in the process, because we're trying to figure out how serious the student is about applying. And I think, well, I don't want to speak for other people, but you know, it depends on what your application pool looks like as to why you use it or why you may more emphasize it a bit more. But for us, at least, you know, especially having gone test optional, and somebody asked about the number of applications, when you get that many applications, you essentially are looking at 3 potential pools of admitted students that can make up your class. And so then you do start to ask those questions of yourself. Well, okay, well, if I admit this student and this other student can't be admitted, you know, what else can I look at? And it is kind of like, well, which one is more likely to actually come here? And so I wouldn't say that it gets as granular as some students tend to think. I'm not sitting down thinking, did they virtually visit or in-person visit, especially again with the pandemic. So it is more that bigger picture. But I think it's more of a factor because we want to admit students, knowing that those students are more serious about coming versus a student who kind of thought like, oh, this is a reach school. I heard about it once. This seems kind of interesting, and throws an application in. And we don't know that, but we are kind of trying to at least see the extremes, I guess I would say.
Awesome. Thank you, Neil. And I know we're basically out of time, but I did want to, there was one question that I thought was interesting also, and was a symptom of this past year, which is the ballooning of applicants to colleges. And this, I think it was mostly across the board, but certainly for moderately to highly selective colleges, you saw more students willing to throw their hat in the ring. And the question from this one parent was, so with this ballooning of applications, how do you go about the holistic review? Obviously, you have a limited amount of manpower, bandwidth. How do you review just a larger number of applications and deal with this? Perhaps a new issue emerges, not just this year, but moving forward, and I think this might be in part because of test optional, students are more willing and interested without the barrier of testing to try their hand. So any thoughts about the explosion of applications and how that might impact general application review?
I can just speak to this briefly. We flex our staff. So obviously our admissions counselors read, but we also hire seasonal readers. And that's how we're able to continue to get through the growth of applicants, and also why it takes us so long to get back to you. We hear, you know, we're slow and late because we don't release decisions until March, but it takes us that amount of time to read all the applications.
I'll just say that for last year, we largely abandoned our other activity that we would have wanted to do in the wintertime. We just read applications, and the volume said, you don't do this. Is the most important thing you do. Put your eggs into that basket. So that's what we did.
Awesome. Thanks all. I don't know if, oh, I think she's still gone. Jessica, any final words?
I do. Thank you so much for being a part of this. And thank you for everything that you've done. When you close your window, everyone, after you get done participating, there is a 5-question survey. We appreciate your feedback. Please give us anything you want to give us back about that. We encourage you to check the schedule because the college fair is starting at the top of the hour after this. So please join some of the institutions after this. You'll be able to find this session's recordings as well as so many others from today at strivescan.com/SAIS. Thank you. Bye-bye.